Thank you for joining us again today as we dive into our third lesson in our series on Stay. Once again, we're thankful to Challenge Youth Conference, CYC, for getting the men together to put together these videos to share them with us. I'm thankful that we have opportunity now to be able to talk about these videos and have a little bit of discussion with them. Today's lesson is going to be about Stay Humble. And our speaker today is going to be talking about that wonderful time where Jesus' disciples were trying to figure out who was the greatest. And Jesus, in the only way that Jesus knows how, is able to talk to them, and not just talk to them, but show them humility by taking the time to wash their feet. So please enjoy this video. After it's over, we'll come back and discuss it a little bit more.
In Mark chapter 9, Peter, James, and John had the privilege of being able to go up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. And they got to see the spectacle of having Elijah and Moses and Jesus. And what they saw was amazing. But they also saw the rebuke that happened with Peter. When Peter said, let's build 3 tabernacles, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. And then they heard that voice come down from heaven. He's coming down from the mountain with his tail between his legs as he's had that rebuke, and you know that he must feel miserable about that. Well, that miserableness is going to continue, because as they get down to the mountain, they find the scribes and Pharisees that are arguing with one another, and they notice that the other disciples are there. And Jesus comes and he asks them in Mark chapter 9, verse 14 and following, he says, "What are you arguing about?" This man comes up and says, I have this boy who's mute and he has this unclean spirit. And it causes him to have seizures and problems. And I went to your disciples to have him healed and they weren't able to do it. Jesus heals the boy, and after the fact, he looks at the disciples and says, "Oh, you of little faith, you knew that this needed much prayer and fasting." Well, if that wasn't enough for the disciples, you had Peter's rebuke, and then you had the disciples being really told off by Jesus of that they didn't have much faith. Then as they move on to Capernaum in your Bibles, if you'll look at Mark chapter 9, verse 33, we find that as they come to Capernaum, when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent. For on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Isn't that strange? After those rebukes with Jesus, now they come down from the mountain, they're on their way to Capernaum, and they're talking with one another, arguing with one another about who is the greatest. Jesus knows this, but they don't want him to know, and they think they're hiding it from him. Now, in my mind, I have a feeling this is between James and John and Peter. They were the 2 sons of thunder, as the Bible says, and their mom had wanted one to sit at the right and one to sit at the left. And then Peter, who's listed as first as all the apostles, seems to have an ego issue already. And as they're arguing, maybe they're arguing about which of those 3 are the greatest. Jesus finds out. You know, it's only natural for them to do that, I guess, because we all want to be somebody. And if you think about it, those disciples, they were celebrities at the time. They were one of the 12 called the apostles, the disciples of Jesus. Everywhere Jesus went, they followed, and people began to recognize them and know who they were, some of them by name. It's only natural for them to really want to be somebody. That's the way we all want to be. We all want to be the best that we can be. We all want to be somebody. Maybe it's the starting quarterback. Maybe it's the valedictorian. Maybe it's first chair. Maybe it's the cool person. Maybe it's Miss Popular. Maybe it's the prettiest. whatever it is, we all want that title because we want to be the best that we can be. And is there anything wrong with that? Not on the surface. But we do have to be careful. Because what we have in John chapter 13, later on, before Jesus is carried off into the garden and arrested, we have Jesus really revealing to them what kind of people that they needed to be. What kind of people that they needed to have. They needed to be servants. They needed to be humble. In John chapter 13, Jesus is with his disciples in the upper room. He stands up and he takes off his outer garments and he takes a towel and he ties it around himself. He pours water in a basin and begins to kneel down and wash the disciples' feet. He washes Peter. He washes James. He washes John. He washes Judas. He goes through and he washes every one of the disciples' feet. Now, of course, the disciples, they don't understand this because feet washing was meant for the servant. That was meant for the lowest in the house to be able to do. It's not meant for Jesus to do. If anybody needed to be washing any feet, it needed to be the disciples washing Christ's feet. But Christ is the one that kneels down. Christ is the one that washes their feet. He stands up and he says, "What I'm doing to you now, you don't understand. But you will later on. And what you've seen me do to you, you need to be doing likewise. Because the master is not greater than the servant, or the owner greater than the servant. The servant is the one that will be the greatest. If you call me Lord and teacher," Jesus says, "for so I am, if I then kneel down to wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you an example," he says. An example. You see, we're taught by others to push ourselves to be the best that we can be, to be the greatest that we can be, to gain these titles and to be the best at whatever we can be. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as we understand that we must stay humble. We must remain a servant and keep that mindset. By keeping the mindset of a servant, we'll make sure that we put other people in front of us. And even though we may be good at something, we may be the starting quarterback, we may be valedictorian, we may be first chair, we may be the prettiest, we may be the coolest, whatever that is, as long as we stay humble, we'll be able to have a pleasing life to God. And after all, that's what it's all about. It's easy for us to want to be the greatest at something. It's easy for us to want to be the best. But there's not many of us that want to be the servant. See, Jesus knew these disciples. It was going to be easy for them to get the big head. It was going to be easy for them to feel like they were celebrities. But He had to teach them something that was going to enable them to remember Him. I bet they remember the water, the sound of that water as it entered that basin. I bet they remember the look on Christ's face as they looked down upon Him and He looked up at them as He washed their feet. I bet those images stuck into their heads so that they would stay humble. I want those images to stick in our heads as well. I mean, you imagine the exchange between Judas and Jesus as He washes His feet? Between Peter and Jesus as He washes His feet? Imagine Jesus washing your feet. And maybe that image that you have of the look that He has on His face as you look at Him and He stares back at you as you think of the sin that you've committed the last week, as you think of the words that you say and the thoughts that you've had, maybe that might help us stay humble. Because by doing that, Jesus provides us three things. Three things revealed to us in this passage of John chapter 13 that will help us stay humble. And as you look with your class, as you read the text of John chapter 13 and read the chapter, I hope you talk about these three things. and how they relate to your life, and make it real to you. Because we all need humility. We all need the opportunity to stay humble.
So as the disciples fight amongst themselves to see who is the greatest, Jesus takes this opportunity to teach them such a wonderful lesson. And it's a lesson that we all can learn from today. We all sometimes need to take the time to remember to be humble, to trust in God, to realize that titles in this world aren't all that important. Jesus is trying to teach us, instead of seeking to gain a title as who is the greatest, we need to be thinking about picking up the towel and serving as Jesus served. So there are three things that Jesus teaches us when He takes the time to wash His disciples' feet. The first thing about humility that Jesus teaches us is that it gives us security. And I know a lot of times we think about our titles in our life and the things that we have, and we take security in those, our homes, our finances, maybe even people in our life who we seek security from. But if we truly think about it, we can be humble, thinking about being a servant of God, knowing that God's going to be there to protect us. God is our security. And being humble helps teach us that lesson to rely on God, that His will is going to be done, and we just need to follow Him. Secondly, the story that we read about of Jesus teaching the disciples about humility, it helps us to surrender. The story is told, and maybe you've experienced it yourself, of a congregation who sings the song, "Oh, the Bitter Pain and Sorrow." And that song is otherwise known as "All of Self and None of Thee." And I'm pretty sure you all are familiar with that song. And so the verses progress in a story about how we change our mind from being all about us to being about God. The first verse closes with "all of self and none of thee," followed by verse 2 that says "some of self and some of thee." Then the third verse, "less of self and more of thee." And finally, in a crescendo, you get loud at the very end, the final line of the verse that says "none of self and all of thee." Well, the story goes about a congregation who, as we all typically do on our final song before we dismiss, they just sang the first verse of this song, which at the end of the song, that first verse, it says, "We proudly say to Jesus, all of self and none of thee." And we all know that that congregation had no intention of leaving with that mindset of that they're all about themselves, not about Jesus. It just happened by accident. We get into habit, we sing just the first verse and not thinking about the rest of the story. But yet, how often does that also happen in our lives? We don't intend to leave Jesus out. We don't intend to put ourselves ahead of God. We don't always strive at putting ourselves to be more important than God, but doesn't it turn out that way? Sometimes we forget to put God first. Sometimes we forget to be that servant. And too many times, without us maybe even realizing, we tell God, all of self and none of thee. And thinking instead we should be saying, none of self and all of thee. And I hope that we can think about that in our lives today, to think about whether or not in our life that we're living, that we are giving all to God and not lifting up ourselves. Thirdly, the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, what it teaches us about humility is that it challenges us to serve. Jesus finishes His object lesson with a challenge. He says, "If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." John 13:17. His example sets forth for us a challenge on what it means to be blessed. As we seek to serve, we maintain a lifestyle of humility, enabling us to stay humble. Jesus said it best in Acts 20 and verse 35. He says, "It is truly more blessed to give than to receive." And I hope that we all can take that thought and make it into our life. Make it be something that we practice each and every day. As every week, we want to leave you with some discussion for you to think on at home and maybe even discuss with your family. And so I'm going to read these for us and for you to think about it. And then after this video is over, they're going to be on the screen for you to be able to pause, to reread again, and to think about at home. I want you to think about, I want you to describe what it must have been like for the disciples. What it was in their point of view as they observed what Jesus was doing. You think about what was going through their mind and how they must have felt and how small they must have realized, that they were thinking about because of what Jesus was doing. Secondly, why is it so hard to lay down our titles and pick up the towel and serve? They wanted to know who was the greatest, who was going to receive that title of the greatest. Instead, they should have been thinking about picking up that towel and serve. So why is it so hard for us to do that in our life? And we want you to think about that. Thirdly, what are some things that we can do to promote a lifestyle of service? This is a good thing to actually write down. Something physical that you can put in front of you to complete this challenge. What are some things that we can do to promote a lifestyle of service and not serve ourselves? That needs to be the first thing we don't put down on this list. Thank you again for joining us in this third lesson in the series of Stay. We hope that you've been enjoying these. We'll continue to put these out next week. We thank Challenge Youth Conference for providing us with these lessons, with these discussion questions, and these videos. We hope that you have and enjoy the rest of your day.